What would you do if a police officer wrongly accused your child of a crime she didn't commit? How would you feel if that same officer, filled with prejudice, realized he had made the biggest mistake of his life? In a small town, a young black girl is arrested by an officer who assumes guilt based on her appearance. But when the truth emerges, it sets him on a journey that challenges everything he believed about justice, community, and himself. What happens next will make you rethink how we judge each other and how far someone will go to right a wrong. Before we dive into today's story, let us know where you're tuning in from in the comments below, then hit that subscribe button so you never miss out on our latest content. The sun was setting behind the trees lining Broad Street in Alderwood, Missouri. Officer Jake Harden leaned back in his patrol car, his hand resting on the steering wheel, the other tapping his radio. He'd been on patrol here for years, and tonight felt just like any other. The street lights flickered on, signaling the start of another quiet shift. Jake loved this town, the control it gave him. In his mind, he was the town's protector in a world that seemed to be falling apart. He had a reputation for being thorough, unyielding, the kind of cop who didn't make excuses. Alderwood needed that, and Jake was more than willing to fill the role. As he passed a convenience store, something caught his attention. A little girl, around 8 or 9, sitting on a bench outside, eating crackers. Her pink dress was a little worn, and her dark curls were pulled into a neat ponytail. She looked anxious, scanning the area as though she didn't belong. Jake frowned. No adults were with her. Something felt off. He pulled over, his patrol car coming to a slow stop across the street. He observed for a moment a child alone near a store. What if she had stolen something? He'd seen it before, kids getting into trouble, parents nowhere to be found. It was his job to keep the peace, and if stopping a potential problem before it got worse was part of that, so be it. Jake swung open the door and stepped out, boots thudding against the pavement as he walked toward the girl. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with uncertainty. "Hey there," Jake said, his voice calm but with an edge. "Where are your parents?" The girl clutched her crackers tighter, her voice barely audible. "My mom's inside. She's shopping. She said I could wait here." Jake glanced toward the store. The evening rush had packed the place with shoppers. No one seemed to be looking for the girl. He nodded at the crackers in her hands. "Did you pay for those?" Her eyes widened in panic. "My mom gave them to me," she stammered. "I didn't take anything, I promise." Jake's suspicion grew. The girl seemed too nervous. Her eyes kept darting back to the store, as if waiting for someone. He crossed his arms, looming over her. "Let's be honest," he said, his tone sharp. "Did you steal those?" Tears filled the girl's eyes. "No, sir," she whispered, shaking her head, but Jake had already decided. He grabbed her arm and pulled her off the bench. "Come on," he said, his voice cold. "We'll wait inside. You can explain it to your mom." The girl began to cry, her small body trembling with fear. "I didn't do anything wrong," she sobbed. "My mom's coming back, I promise." Jake didn't soften. His job wasn't to question, it was to enforce. He marched her toward the store, ignoring the stares from bystanders. Inside the store was a cacophony of voices, the buzz of registers, and the clatter of shopping carts. Carolyn Grant was in the middle of checking her list, grabbing a few last-minute items before heading to the checkout. Her mind was split between the dinner she was planning and the work emails she needed to catch up on. She glanced at her watch. She was running out of time. A commotion at the front of the store caught her attention. She looked up, her breath catching in her throat as she saw Jake, the officer, leading her daughter Mia inside. Her heart sank. "Mia." Carolyn rushed toward them, leaving her shopping bags behind. She knelt in front of her daughter, wiping away the tears on Mia's cheeks. "What's going on? What happened?" Mia threw herself into her mother's arms, sobbing. "Mommy, I didn't do anything. The man thinks I stole the crackers." Carolyn's eyes shot up to Jake, fury burning in her gaze. "She didn't steal anything," she snapped, her voice tight with anger. "I gave her those crackers." "What do you think you're doing?" Jake stood his ground. "I saw a child sitting alone outside the store with snacks. She seemed nervous. I had reason to believe she might have taken them without paying." Carolyn rose to her feet, her fists clenched. "You had no reason to lay a hand on my daughter," she fired back. "She's 9 years old, for God's sake. She was just waiting for me." A small crowd had gathered near the entrance, drawn by the raised voices. People whispered to each other, their faces a mixture of concern and confusion. Jake felt the weight of their gaze, but didn't flinch. In his mind, he was just doing his job. Carolyn's voice trembled with rage. "Take your hand off my daughter, right now. This is unacceptable." For the first time, Jake hesitated. He could see the fear in Mia's eyes, the fury in her mother's, and the murmurs of the crowd growing louder. Admitting he was wrong didn't come easily to him, but in that moment he dug in his heels. "Mom, I was following protocol," he said, his voice firm. "It's my duty to investigate suspicious behavior." "Suspicious?" Carolyn shouted, her voice cracking with disbelief. "She's a child, a scared little girl waiting for her mom. That's suspicious to you?" By now, more people had pulled out their phones, recording the scene. Jake's face flushed, the weight of the moment settling on him, but he wasn't ready to back down. His voice was clipped. "I'm just trying to keep the community safe." "Safe?" Carolyn's voice wavered, filled with disbelief. "By treating innocent children like criminals? My daughter isn't a threat to you or anyone else." Jake opened his mouth to reply, but before he could, someone from the crowd shouted, "This is wrong. Let the kid go." The store's manager arrived with a couple of employees, and Jake stood there in silence, the crowd pressing in around him. He felt the weight of judgment from every side. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crept in. Maybe he had gone too far. Maybe it wasn't as clear-cut as he had thought. Carolyn knelt down again, brushing the tears from Mia's face. "It's okay, sweetie," she whispered. "I'm here now. You're safe." Jake released his grip on Mia's arm, stepping back. But the damage was done. The shift in the air was palpable. The way the crowd looked at him, the tremor in the mother's voice, it all felt wrong. Carolyn stood up, eyes blazing. "I'm filing a formal complaint against you," she said, her tone icy. "This is unacceptable." Jake clenched his jaw, fighting to keep his composure. "You have the right to do that," he replied stiffly. "But I was just doing my job." Carolyn didn't respond. She turned and led me out of the store, leaving Jake standing there alone. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. As the days passed, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. He tried to push it aside, burying himself in his work and convincing himself that he had done his duty, that he was just keeping the peace. But the image of Mia's tear-streaked face haunted him. The whispers around town grew louder. It wasn't long before the complaint reached the police chief. Jake found himself sitting in a cold, sterile office, facing the stern gaze of his superior. "Jake," the chief said, his voice heavy with disappointment, "we've had a formal complaint filed against you, racial profiling. A little girl." "Jake, what were you thinking?" Jake's mouth went dry. He hadn't thought of it that way. It wasn't about race, was it? It was about protocol, about suspicion. But the chief wasn't convinced. "You're suspended until further notice," the chief said, his tone final. The investigation was underway. Jake was told he would need to attend sensitivity training, and depending on the outcome, there could be further consequences. He nodded, numb, and left the office in a daze, his mind spinning. The badge that had once given him purpose now felt like a weight he could barely carry. The sensitivity training was supposed to be a simple, routine task, something Jake thought he could breeze through. But as the days passed, something inside him began to change. The stories he heard, The examples discussed, they all began to hit a little too close to home. He thought back to Mia, to the snap judgments he had made about her. What if he had been wrong? What if his instincts weren't as infallible as he had always believed? By the end of the training, Jake wasn't the same man who had walked in. He had been forced to confront something ugly inside himself, something he hadn't wanted to see. But the real test came when he was sent to volunteer at a local community center as part of his suspension. Jake had never been one for community outreach. His job was enforcing the law, not making friends. But with no other choice, he found himself at the doors of the local food bank, feeling out of place in civilian clothes. The moment he entered, his eyes landed on a familiar face, Carolyn. She was serving food to a line of families stretching out the door, and beside her was Mia, smiling as she helped with the trays. Jake's heart sank. Carolyn saw him too, and her expression immediately hardened. Jake noticed the way her body stiffened, how she moved protectively closer to her daughter. She didn't need to say anything. The message was clear. You're not welcome here. Jake spent the rest of the day keeping his head down, avoiding eye contact. He carried boxes of canned goods, swept the floor, and did what was asked. But the weight of guilt never left him. Days turned into weeks, and Jake kept showing up, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he could prove he wasn't the man they thought he was. Little by little, he began to see the community in a new light. He witnessed the struggles these families faced, the challenges they dealt with every day. He saw how hard people worked just to get by, and he realized he had been blind to it for so long. One afternoon, while stacking boxes in the back room, Jake overheard a conversation between two volunteers. "Yeah, they've been helping out here for years," one of them said. "Carolyn started after her mom passed. She's been giving back ever since. Mia's always here too. Sweet kid." Smart as a whip, Jake froze. The little girl he had accused of stealing the child he had handcuffed was a regular volunteer at the food bank. She was helping others, just like her mother. The realization hit him hard. He had been so wrong, so terribly wrong. His hands trembled slightly as he placed the box down, his mind replaying the conversation. Carolyn and Mia weren't just some random family passing through town. They were pillars of the community, working tirelessly to help others. And Mia, how could he have missed it? She was just a child, innocent, kind, and he had treated her like a criminal. Jake's stomach churned with guilt. How many others had he misjudged in the past, blinded by his own assumptions and biases? That evening, Jake sat alone in his small apartment, the faint glow from the street light barely cutting through the darkness. He stared at the blank wall, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't quiet. For years he had patrolled these streets, thinking he was the town's protector, the one who kept order. But now he wondered if he had ever truly understood the people he was supposed to serve. For all his years of experience, he had seen things in black and white, never truly seeing the complexities of the people around him. Good or bad, right or wrong, Jake found himself wrestling with these questions more than ever. The more he reflected on what had happened with Mia, the more he realized that life wasn't as simple as he had always believed. People weren't just problems to be solved or threats to be neutralized. They were human beings with their own stories, struggles, and complexities, which he had never truly bothered to see. Jake stood up abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. He couldn't sit with these thoughts any longer. He had to do something. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, unsure of where he was going, but knowing he couldn't stay locked inside his own mind anymore. The next day, Jake returned to the community center, unsure of what to expect. He hadn't seen Carolyn or Mia since that conversation, and part of him hoped they wouldn't be there today. But as he stepped inside, there they were standing behind the serving counter, smiles on their faces as they handed out food to the line of people waiting. Jake swallowed hard, trying to push down the guilt that tightened in his chest. He couldn't avoid this forever. If he was going to face the consequences of his actions, he needed to do it head-on. He made his way to the back of the room, grabbed a broom, and started sweeping the floor. His plan was simple: stay out of sight, keep his head down, and just do the work. But as he swept, he couldn't help but glance up every now and then, watching Carolyn and Mia, the way they worked together, the way Mia's face lit up when she made someone smile. It was clear this wasn't just charity for them. It was their way of giving back, of connecting with the people around them. Jake's mind raced. He had to make things right. But how? An apology seemed too little, too late. What else could he do? Before he could think it through, Carolyn approached him, her face expressionless. "Officer Hardin," she said, her voice calm but firm, "can we talk?" Jake's heart pounded in his chest, but he nodded, setting the broom aside. "Of course," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Carolyn led him to a small room at the back of the center, away from the hustle of the main area. As soon as the door closed behind them, she turned to face him, arms crossed over her chest. "I know why you're here," she said, her voice steady. "You're trying to make up for what you did to Mia. I appreciate that you're trying, but I need to hear it from you. Do you understand what you did wrong?" Jake felt the weight of her words press down on him. He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. I made assumptions," he began, his voice shaking. "I saw Mia sitting alone and jumped to conclusions. I thought she was up to no good. I didn't stop to think about what was really happening. I didn't listen to her when she tried to explain. I let my own biases cloud my judgment, and I hurt her. I hurt both of you." Carolyn's expression didn't soften, but she didn't interrupt him either. Jake continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I was wronged, Carolyn, so wrong. And I know that saying sorry doesn't fix what I did, but I am sorry. I've been thinking about it every day since it happened. I need you to know that I am going to do better. I don't want to be that kind of officer. I don't want to be that kind of person." For a long moment, the room was silent. Jake stood there, his heart in his throat, waiting for Carolyn's response. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, but still steady. "I appreciate your honesty," she said, "but it's not me you owe an apology to. It's Mia." Jake nodded, swallowing hard. "I know, and I'll apologize to her too. But I need to ask, what can I do? How can I make things right?" Carolyn looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Finally, she let out a sigh. "Actions speak louder than words, Officer Hardin. You want to make things right. Prove it. Show us that you've changed. Keep showing up. Keep doing the work. That's how you make things right." Jake nodded, a strange mixture of relief and guilt washing over him. He hadn't expected forgiveness, and he certainly didn't feel he deserved it. But the fact that Carolyn was willing to give him a chance to prove himself felt like a lifeline he hadn't known he needed. Over the next few weeks, Jake did just that. He showed up at the community center every day, helping wherever he could. He worked quietly, doing his best to stay out of the way, but always keeping an eye on Mia and Carolyn. He still hadn't worked up the courage to speak directly to Mia, but he was determined to earn her trust. As time passed, Jake began to notice subtle changes in the way people treated him. At first, there had been wary glances and hushed conversations whenever he entered the room, but as the days turned into weeks, those glances softened and the whispers faded. People started to greet him with nods, and some even stopped to chat with him while he worked. One afternoon, as Jake was restocking shelves in the pantry, Mia approached him, her hands clasped behind her back. Jake's heart skipped a beat. This was at the moment he had both dreaded and hoped for. Mia said softly, her eyes wide with curiosity. Jake set down the box he was holding and knelt down to her level. "Hi, Mia," he said gently. Mia shifted from foot to foot, her gaze flickering between Jake and the floor. Mom said you're here to help, she said after a moment. Jake nodded. That's right. I'm here to help. Mia bit her lip, then looked up at him with those big innocent eyes that had haunted him for so long. Are you really sorry for what you did? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake felt a lump form in his throat. He swallowed hard, nodding. Yes, Mia, I'm really, really sorry. I didn't listen to you when I should have, and I didn't treat you the way you deserve to be treated. I'm sorry. Mia stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she nodded. Okay, she said softly. I forgive you. Jake blinked, taken aback by her words. He hadn't expected forgiveness, especially not from Mia, but hearing her say those words lifted a weight off his shoulders. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt a spark of hope. Jake hadn't realized the weight he was carrying until it started to lift. Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Thank you, Mia. Mia gave him a small smile before turning and skipping back to where Carolyn was waiting. Jake watched her go, a strange sense of peace settling over him. He knew he still had a long way to go, but in that moment he felt like he had taken the first real step toward making things right. Jake's transformation didn't stop at the community center. As he continued to volunteer, he found himself becoming more involved in the lives of the people he served. He listened to their stories, learned about their struggles, and began to see the world through their eyes. He realized how much he had missed over the years, how many people he had judged unfairly, how many opportunities he had missed to make a real difference. One day, as Jake was helping to organize a food drive, Carolyn approached him with a clipboard in hand. Officer Hardin, she said, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. I think it's time we take this to the next level. Jake raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. What do you mean? Carolyn handed him the clipboard. We're planning a community outreach event, she explained. We want to bring people together, residents, police officers, everyone. It's about building bridges. It's about showing that we're all on the same side, and we'd like you to help us organize it. Jake stared at the clipboard in his hands, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and disbelief. Me? He asked, his voice tinged with surprise. You want me to help? Carolyn nodded. You've been doing the work, Officer Hardin. You've shown us that you're serious about making things right. Now it's time to take the next step. Jake felt a surge of gratitude. This was more than just a chance to make amends. It was an opportunity to truly make a difference. He smiled, feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. I'm in, he said, his voice steady. Let's do this. As the weeks passed, Jake threw himself into planning the event. He worked closely with Carolyn and the other volunteers, organizing activities, setting up meetings with local leaders, and reaching out to the police department to get them involved. He knew it wouldn't be easy. There was still a lot of mistrust between the community and the police, but he was determined to make it work. The day of the event finally arrived, and the park was buzzing with excitement. Families from all over town had gathered for the community picnic, and for the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he belonged. He walked through the park, greeting people, shaking hands, and chatting with the kids who were running around, playing games. As the afternoon wore on, Jake found himself standing near the dunk tank, watching as a group of kids lined up to take their turn at dunking one of the police officers. Mia was at the front of the line, a mischievous grin on her face. She aimed the ball at the target. Jake couldn't help but smile as he watched her. This was what it was all about, bringing people together, building trust, and showing that they were all part of the same community. The sun began its slow descent, turning the sky a soft orange. Laughter echoed across the park, blending with the sounds of kids chasing each other and parents chatting over picnic tables. The community picnic had been a success. far beyond what Jake had imagined. He moved through the crowd, watching people he'd once viewed as strangers now interacting with officers and volunteers alike. The tension that had once hung in the air was nowhere to be found. Mia, her curly hair bouncing as she ran, sprinted toward Jake with a huge smile on her face. Her joy was infectious, and for a moment, Jake's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and relief. After everything, this was what mattered: trust, laughter, connection. You did it, Mia said, her voice bubbling with excitement. You really helped put all this together. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. Nah, kid, I just helped. It was your mom and all these other folks who made it happen. Mia grinned, wiping sweat from her forehead as she caught her breath. But you're part of it, too. That's what Mom says, she said. You've been doing a really good job. Jake's smile faltered for a second as he looked down at the young girl who had once been terrified of him. Her forgiveness had been a gift he hadn't thought he deserved. It wasn't that long ago that he had misjudged her so badly. Yet here she was, not just forgiving him, but celebrating with him. Thanks, Mia, Jake said softly, bending down to meet her eye level. That means more than you know. Mia giggled, her earlier energy returning. Come on, Jake. I want to show you the face painting booth. Mom's over there with the other volunteers. Jake stood up, brushing the grass from his knees as Mia grabbed his hand and led him across the park. As they approached the face painting booth, Jake's gaze fell on Carolyn, who was talking with some of the other mothers. Her face was radiant with the satisfaction of a day well spent. She spotted Jake and Mia and waved them over. You're just in time, Carolyn said with a playful smile. I was about to volunteer you for the dunk tank again. Jake chuckled. I think I've been dunked enough times for one day, but if it makes the kids happy, I'll do it again. Carolyn raised an eyebrow, laughing. Don't tempt them. They'll take you up on that offer in a heartbeat. The two of them stood there for a moment, watching Mia run off to join her friends. For a while, neither of them spoke. The atmosphere between them had changed, no longer charged with the tension and anger that had marked their earlier interactions. Instead, there was a quiet understanding, a shared sense of purpose. I didn't think I'd ever see a day like this, Carolyn said softly, her eyes scanning the crowd. It's been a long time coming, Jake said, nodding. His mind drifted back to all the moments that had led them here, the mistakes he'd made, the biases he'd carried, and the work he'd put in to try and make things right. Jake agreed. But we're here now, that's what matters. Carolyn glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. You've changed, Jake. I didn't believe it at first. I thought you were just trying to save face, maybe hoping we'd forget what happened. But I see it now. You're not the same man who put my daughter in handcuffs. Jake swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. I'm not, he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Or at least, I don't want to be. I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, more than I care to admit. But this ... what happened with Mia? That was a wake-up call. I needed to face some hard truths about myself, and I'm still learning. I'll probably be learning for the rest of my life. Carolyn smiled faintly, her eyes softening. We all are. None of us have it all figured out. But what matters is that you're trying. You're showing up day after day. And that means something. Jake looked down at the ground, unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to receiving praise, especially not from someone he had hurt so deeply. But hearing those words from Carolyn, someone who had every right to despise him, meant more than he could express. Thank you, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. That means a lot coming from you. Carolyn nodded, her gaze lingering on him for a moment longer before she turned her attention back to the picnic. You know, she said after a pause, there's something I've been meaning to talk to you about. Jake raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. What's that? Carolyn hesitated for a moment, as if weighing her words carefully. The food bank, she said finally. We've been running it for years, but we're starting to get overwhelmed. The need in this community is growing, and we're struggling to keep up. I was wondering if you'd be interested in helping out more regularly, not just volunteering here and there, but really stepping up. We could use someone like you, someone who knows this community and cares about it. Jake blinked, taken aback by the offer. He had never considered himself someone who could make a real difference in the community. His job had always been about law and order, about keeping the peace. But now, standing here surrounded by people he had come to care about, he realized that there was more to being an officer, more to being a member of this town, than just enforcing the rules. I'd be honored, he said, his voice steady. Whatever you need, I'm there. Carolyn smiled, a genuine warmth in her eyes. Good, we could use someone with your skills and your heart. Jake felt a surge of pride at her words. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself, something that truly mattered. As the weeks passed, Jake's role in the community grew. He spent more and more time at the food bank, helping organize drives, distribute supplies, and coordinate with local businesses to secure donations. He was no longer just Officer Hardin, the stern, no-nonsense cop who patrolled the streets. He had become Jake, the man who was working to heal the wounds he had caused and build trust in a community that had once feared him. His fellow officers noticed the change, too. At the station, word had spread about Jake's involvement in the community. While some were skeptical at first, others were inspired by his transformation. One by one, officers started volunteering at the food bank, joining Jake in his efforts to make a positive impact. At first, there were whispers behind his back, murmurs of doubt about whether Jake's change of heart was genuine. But as time went on, those whispers faded. Jake's actions spoke louder than any words could, and soon even the most skeptical officers were taking notice. One afternoon, as Jake was finishing up a shift at the food bank, Officer Maya Rodriguez approached him, her arms crossed and a smirk on her face. I've got to hand it to you, Jake, she said, her tone teasing but not unkind. I didn't think you had it in you. Jake raised an eyebrow, chuckling softly. Had what in me, the whole community outreach thing, Maya replied, leaning against the doorway. You were always the by-the-book guy. I didn't think you'd be the type to roll up your sleeves and get your hands dirty. Jake shrugged, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. People can surprise you. Maya laughed, shaking her head. Yeah, you're full of surprises lately, but I'll admit it's working. You've got some of the other guys talking about getting involved. Maybe you're onto something. Jake nodded, feeling a sense of satisfaction. It wasn't about proving anything to his fellow officers. It was about doing what was right. But if his actions could inspire others to think differently, to approach their work with more empathy, then that was a win. Thanks, Maya, Jake said, his tone sincere. But this isn't about me. It's about the people we're supposed to serve. Maya's smirk softened into a genuine smile. I hear you, and I respect that. Keep it up, Jake. The station could use more people like you. As Maya turned to leave, Jake stood there for a moment, reflecting on how far he had come. A few months ago, he would never have imagined himself in this position, respected, not just for his ability to enforce the law, but for his commitment to the community. It was a humbling realization, and one that filled him with a deep sense of purpose. The following week, Carolyn and Mia invited Jake over for dinner. It was a quiet Sunday evening, the air crisp as the first hints of autumn began to settle over Alderwood. Jake arrived at their house, feeling a mix of nerves and gratitude. He hadn't expected to be welcomed into their home, not after everything that had happened. But here he was, standing on their doorstep, feeling like he was about to cross a threshold that meant more than just a meal. Carolyn opened the door, her warm smile putting him at ease. Come on in, she said, stepping aside to let him in. "Dinner's almost ready." Jake stepped inside, taking in the cozy, lived-in feel of the house. The smell of home-cooked food filled the air, and he could hear Mia giggling in the other room, playing with her toes. "You've got a nice place," Jake said, glancing around. Carolyn smiled, a touch of pride in her eyes. "Thanks, it's home." As they sat down to eat, the conversation flowed easily. Mia chattered excitedly about school, telling Jake all about her favorite subjects and the friends she had made. Carolyn shared stories about her work at the food bank, and Jake listened, feeling more connected to them with each passing minute. At one point, as they were finishing up dessert, Carolyn leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You know," she said softly, "I've been thinking about that day at the store, about how everything could have turned out so differently." Jake's stomach tightened at the mention of the incident, but he didn't interrupt. "I was so angry at you," Carolyn continued, her voice steady. "I didn't think I'd ever be able to forgive you for what you did to Mia. And part of me still holds on to that anger, if I'm being honest." Jake nodded, understanding. He didn't expect the anger to just disappear. It was justified. "But then I see you here," Carolyn said, her gaze meeting his. "I see the work you've done, the way you've committed yourself to this community, and I realize that people can change. You've shown us that." Jake swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. "I don't know if I deserve your forgiveness," he said quietly, "but I'm going to keep trying to earn it." Carolyn smiled, a small, gentle smile that carried more weight than Jake could put into words. "You already have, Jake. You already have." The weeks stretched into months, and Jake's role in the community continued to evolve. He became a familiar face at the food bank, the park, and local events. People who had once avoided him now greeted him warmly, and kids who had once seen him as a figure of authority now saw him as someone they could trust. But the most significant change was within Jake himself. He had learned to listen to the people around him, to understand their fears, their struggles, their hopes. He no longer saw the world in black and white. Instead, he saw the shades of gray, the complexity of human lives, and the importance of empathy in his work as an officer. One day, as Jake walked through the town square, he overheard a conversation between two teenagers sitting on a bench. They were talking about the upcoming community cleanup event, an initiative Jake had helped organize with the local youth. "That Officer Hardin guy," one of the teens said, "he's actually pretty cool. My little brother got sick and he dropped off food for us last week. Can you believe that?" The other teen nodded. "Yeah, he's been helping at the food bank for a while now. I heard he's the one who started the outreach program with the cops." Jake smiled to himself as he walked past, his heart light. This was the real work, not just keeping the peace, but building something better, something stronger, a community where people looked out for each other, where trust was earned, and where second chances were given. The seasons had changed, and by the time Jake truly felt the shift within himself, it wasn't just the passing days or the tasks he took on at the food bank. It was the look in people's eyes, the way they greeted him now without that edge of fear or mistrust. More than anything, it was the way Mia smiled at him whenever she saw him, full of genuine warmth and affection. That smile had become his barometer for how far he'd come, but he knew his work was far from over. Trust was fragile, and the weight of his past actions would always loom behind him. Yet with each passing day, he felt more connected to this town, to its people, than he had ever felt in his years patrolling its streets. The badge on his chest, which once symbolized authority and enforcement, now felt like a symbol of responsibility, one he would never again take lightly. The community outreach program had grown too. What started as a small food drive had expanded into monthly events, cleanup projects, mentoring sessions for local kids, and workshops where police officers and residents could come together to talk openly and honestly. The tensions that had once simmered under the surface in Alderwood seemed to ease little by little. One Saturday afternoon, as Jake was packing up supplies after a successful youth workshop, he spotted Officer Tom Landry across the park, talking with a group of teenagers. Jake couldn't help but smile. Tom had been one of the officers most resistant to change. He had scoffed at Jake's initial involvement in the community center, dismissing it as soft policing. But now here he was, engaging with the kids, listening to their stories, and offering advice without a hint of judgment. Tom caught Jake's eye and waved him over. "Hey, Hardin," he called out, his tone surprisingly light. "Come meet these kids. They're full of ideas for the next cleanup." Jake strolled over, still amazed by how much things had changed, not just for him, but for everyone. As he approached the group, one of the teenagers, Corey, a tall, lanky kid who had a habit of wearing a baseball cap backward, grinned at him. "Officer Jake," Corey said, offering a mock salute. "We were just telling Officer Landry that we're thinking of organizing a basketball tournament next month. Get some of the cops to play against us. You in?" Jake chuckled. "As long as you go easy on us old guys." Corey laughed, but there was no edge to it, just camaraderie. "Now we're taking you down." The banter continued for a while, light-hearted and genuine. It felt natural, the way it should have always been. The walls that had once existed between Jake and these kids, between the officers and the community, had started to crumble. It wasn't perfect, not by any means, but it was progress, and that was what mattered. Later that evening, as Jake sat on his porch, the quiet of the night settling around him, he thought about how far he'd come. He wasn't the same man who had pulled Mia from that bench outside the store, convinced she was up to no good. He had been forced to confront his own prejudices, his own narrow view of the world, and it hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. As his thoughts drifted, Jake's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, surprised to see a message from Carolyn. "Carolyn, hey Jake, I wanted to thank you again for all your help today. The kids really seem to look up to you, and I know Mia does too. I don't think I ever told you this, but she's been talking about wanting to be a police officer when she grows up. She says she wants to help people like you do." Jake stared at the screen for a long moment, his heart swelling with emotion. Mia wanted to be a cop. He hadn't expected that, not after everything he had put her through, after the fear and confusion he had caused. The idea that she saw him as someone to look up to felt almost surreal. He typed out a response, his fingers trembling slightly. "Jake, thanks, Carolyn. That means more to me than you know. Mia's an incredible kid. She's going to do great things, whatever she decides to do." The next message came quickly. "Carolyn, she's lucky to have someone like you in her life. Jake, we all are." Jake didn't respond right away. He sat there, staring at the message, letting the words sink in. He had spent so long trying to make amends, trying to prove that he was more than the mistakes he'd made. But in that moment, he realized that he didn't need to prove anything anymore. He had already earned their trust. He had already shown them who he truly was, and for the first time in a long while, Jake allowed himself to feel proud. A few weeks later, the community held its biggest event yet, a block party that spanned several streets and drew in hundreds of residents. There was music, food, games, and for the first time, a real sense of unity between the police department and the people they served. Jake stood near one of the food stands, watching as families mingled with officers, laughing and chatting, as though the barriers that had once divided them had never existed. He caught sight of Tom Landry tossing a football with some kids, while Maya Rodriguez helped a group of teenagers paint a mural on the side of a building. Everywhere Jake looked, there was connection, understanding, and something that felt a lot like hope. As Jake made his way through the crowd, Shaking hands and exchanging smiles, he spotted Mia standing near the dunk tank with a group of kids. She waved him over, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Jake," she called out, her voice full of excitement. "You gotta get in the dunk tank again. Everyone's waiting to dunk you." Jake laughed, holding up his hands in mock protest. "Again? I've already been dunked 3 times today." Mia grinned, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "One more time, come on, it's for charity." Jake sighed dramatically, but the truth was he didn't mind at all. This was what it was all about, being part of something bigger than himself, being there for the people who needed him, and showing them that he wasn't just Officer Hardin anymore. He was Jake, their neighbor, their friend. As he climbed into the dunk tank, he saw Carolyn standing nearby, watching with a smile. She gave him a thumbs up, and Jake couldn't help but smile back. "All right, Mia," he called out, settling into the tank. "Let's see what you've got." Mia stepped up to the line, her face serious as he wound up her arm. She tossed the ball, and with a loud splash, Jake was plunged into the cold water. The crowd erupted into laughter and cheers as he climbed out, dripping wet but grinning from ear to ear. He felt something shift inside him. The guilt, the shame, the weight of his past mistakes, they didn't disappear, but they didn't control him anymore. He had faced them, owned them, and worked to make things right. And in doing so, he had found something he hadn't realized. He was missing a sense of belonging, not just as an officer, but as a member of this community. The sun began to set, casting a warm, golden light over the streets as the block party started to wind down. People backed up their booths, kids reluctantly left the game stations, and the music grew softer, signaling the end of the day's festivities. Jake found himself standing at the edge of the park, looking out over the town he had come to love. In a new way, Alderwood wasn't perfect. It had its challenges, its struggles. But it was a place where people cared for one another, where second chances were given, and where change was possible. As he stood there, taking it all in, he felt a small hand slip into his. He looked down to see Mia standing beside him, her wide eyes gazing up at him with admiration. "You did good today, Jake," she said, her voice quiet but full of sincerity. Jake squeezed her hand gently, his heart full. "So did you, kiddo." They stood there for a moment, watching the last few rays of sunlight disappear behind the horizon. The air was cool, the sounds of laughter and conversation fading into the background, and for the first time in a long time, Jake felt at peace. In the months that followed, Jake's role in Alderwood continued to grow. The community outreach program became a staple in the town, with more officers getting involved and more residents feeling comfortable engaging with law enforcement. The bond between the police department and the community grew stronger, and the divisions that had once felt so insurmountable began to fade. One evening, after a long day of volunteering at the food bank, Jake returned home to find a letter in his mailbox. It was from Mia. He opened it, his heart racing as he unfolded the piece of paper. "Dear Jake, thank you for always being there for me and my mom. You've shown me what it really means to help people I know I used to be scared of you. But now I know that you're one of the good ones. I want to be a police officer just like you when I grow up, because I want to help people the way you do. Love." Jake stared at the letter, his vision blurring as tears welled up in his eyes. He had come a long way, but hearing those words from Mia, that was everything. That was the true measure of his journey. He folded the letter carefully, placing it in his pocket, close to his heart. As he stood there, the weight of his past mistakes no longer felt like a burden, but a reminder of the importance of growth, of empathy, and of the power of second chances. Jake Hardin wasn't the same man who had once seen the world in black and white. He was someone who understood the shades of gray, who saw people for who they truly were, and who had learned through hard lessons and deep reflection that every person deserved respect, kindness, and the chance to be seen.